How'd you get here?
I biked.
Is that so? That's not a mythology that you actually bike everywhere.
I bike every single day. There is not a single day that I have had this job that I have not biked to the office.
Using a Lyft bike.
Using a Lyft bike every day.
And you use the electric one.
I do.
There's two options, right?
Yeah, for sure. Classic and electric. Yeah. Only because, I love biking. I've biked for years, but it is true in San Francisco, hills plus the morning equals,
Where do you live?
8 bikes better. Pack Heights.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you went from Pack Heights to here.
Yeah. 21 minutes.
I'm basically in Pack Heights. It took me 24 minutes this morning to drive.
Okay. Right?
Yeah.
Faster. Yeah. No, it's beautiful. No. Cycling is a spectacular way to get around, and particularly e-bikes. It just expands your world.
You actually do that everywhere.
Dude, every single day. Even in New York City, I have, I've got my helmet around.
Oh, so you bring a helmet with you?
I do.
Okay.
Yep. It's got lights on it for the evening so that I try to keep myself safe.
So at night you do too?
Oh, for sure.
Is that your form of exercise?
So I have several different forms of exercise, but it is my most reliable form of exercise.
So what do you mean by that?
Well, what do I mean by that? So, let me start with biking. I have been cycling all my life. In fact, before I got to business school, a friend of mine and I decided, let's do something crazy and bicycle across the United States, as an example. So
what?
Yeah, that was awesome. And what's so funny about that, I have 1,000 stories about it. Of course, it was many years ago. But what is kind of funny is at the time, I was like, this will probably be the only time in my life where I have 2 months I can do something like this. It turns out actually other windows open up over time. But anyway, amazing experience. So I'll come back to that in a little bit. What else do I do? I try to get to the gym once or twice a week. I actually go to a dojo to sort of connect the mind and body. So those are sort of the big three.
You biked across the country?
I did. Yeah.
How many days did it take you?
58. 58 days and 16 flat tires.
How old are you?
A kid. I just had my 59th birthday yesterday.
Wow.
Which is insane. I can't even get my brain around that. And at the time, I guess I was 23. So it was many years ago, before the internet, before cell phones.
Where did you sleep?
It turns out for a lot of the United States, in the center of many towns, particularly if there's a water tower, you can just sort of, at the time, this is 30 years ago, more, you can just roll out a sleeping bag in a tent and set up a tent. So that was usually the deal.
Are you like, I'd say that's fairly extreme.
Yeah.
Was that an outlier for your personality, or is that who you, are you that way?
It's not an outlier. I have reflected on this a little bit. And for whatever temperamental reason, and I don't really have a good answer as to why, but I do tend to go big, and that was an example. A friend of mine and I, literally, who'd never biked more than about 20 miles, before, basically said, look, we both got into business school. We're both finishing up with this consulting gig that we've been doing for a couple of years. Let's do something cool. And I said, and I don't want to sound braggy about it, but it was just like one of those, yeah, let's just do it. Let's just bike across the United States. And we're like, cool, let's do that thing.
When Lyft doesn't segment out its bike bike revenue, correct?
Correct.
But can you give me a sense of how many people are using Lyft bikes?
Sure. So maybe the best way to sort of frame it would be in New York City, which is, a little bit of background. So we operate the bike share program in New York, in San Francisco, in DC, in Boston, in Denver, a couple of other cities. And they're the docked bikes, right? So sometimes there's more than one bike program. These are the docked bikes, the ones that, slide in and out of a dock. Okay, in New York City, which is our biggest city, every day we do maybe 160,000, 170,000 rides every day, right? So that's a very significant... 1,000. So that would be the size, let's say, of a mid-sized city's, public transportation. Every day. Well, every day in the summer. In the winter, people not so much, but in the summer for sure. Yeah, and we break records all the time. So, across the system, you're talking about millions of rides, over the course of a year. And then outside of the United States, we actually, if you've been to Barcelona, for example, if you've been to London, if you've been to, many, many cities around the world, we are the platform that those systems run on top of.
This space is super interesting to me because there's so much temptation to do a bunch of stuff as the platform. And many people probably think they are the platform when they're not actually the platform. So for example, this last mile problem where you got to get a few miles or less. Bird thought that they were the platform, right? Where you have a scooter that takes you. Turns out like that's not the platform,
Correct.
right? Then you go to the other end of the extreme, like Uber is the Uber platform, right? They're basically doing it all, right? You are saying, actually, where we focus is just rides
Yep.
and bikes.
Yep.
Anyway, it'll be interesting. I don't think it's been determined yet how this is going to play out. But this space is super interesting because there's so much that you can do.
Yeah.
And many times you should do none of those things, you know?
Yeah.
But your market cap, and you just joined like a year ago, right?
That's right.
From the board, which is also, I have a lot of questions about, but your market cap would suggest $6 billion today. Uber's is $146 billion. Again, like public markets aren't always right, but they're rewarding Uber for spreading themselves very wide. Yeah, I wonder, like, I don't know. It's less of a question, more of just an observation about the space generally.
I mean, honestly, I've got 1,000 thoughts just on that topic. The first thing I would say, again, not that you were asking a question, but just as a quick observation is, if you look at just in the United States, the number of private vehicle rides per year. So the number of times people get in their own car and drive a place, it's about 160 billion. Okay. And we do, let's call it 700 million. And Uber does maybe twice that. Call it, 1.5 billion. So you're talking about roughly 2.2 billion rides out of 160 billion rides just in cars. So if you just look at just the United States, so if you just look at it that way, I would say there's a very good case that suggests that there's a lot of space just focusing. And then if you look at bike rides, it's sort of infinitely big, in part because every time people get on an e-bike, they become evangelists for the thing. They literally do. It's like pickleball. It's like, why did you play pickleball? Like, for some reason, it is required for you to tell like every one of your friends. Like, have you heard about pickleball? It's like the fastest growing thing. It's unbelievable. It's crazy. It's like a requirement. And same with e-bikes. Like, you take a bike, you're like, I just took an e-bike. Like, for years, I didn't like e-bikes. I thought they were kind of cheating, and now I took it, and now I love it, and blah blah blah. So anyway, if you just look at sort of personal transportation in a very narrow way, it's still an enormous market. So I think there's actually a really good theory of the case that says, you know what, you can both be focused and big and have a huge business.
Yeah, that's fair. Is it when you joined the board in 2021?
Yeah.
And you became the CEO last year. Did you when did you start to think maybe I should run this company?
You know what? I can tell you the exact day. And it was Valentine's Day of last year, 2023, I guess that was. And the reason I say that is because that's the day my phone rang and the board chair, Sean Agrawal, on the other line said, or on the other end said, David, I have an offer that I think you're not going to be able to refuse. So a little context. So as you said, I had joined the board maybe 18 months before. And was really, it was quite an interesting experience. My first public company board that I've been a part of, officially. I'd sort of sat in meetings before, but anyway, that's quite interesting. Transportation space, very interesting. Lyft's a very interesting position. It's in this sort of duopoly. Anyway, all these different things. So I've been on the board for a while. But the frustrating thing about being on a board, and many of your listeners will recognize this, is you actually don't have a huge amount of power on the board. I mean, I guess in one way you have a lot of power, but you don't have that many tools you can use. Yeah. Right? You can use your voice and try to be persuasive. That's pretty much it. And probably 80% of the things you say are wrong because you don't really know the company.
Yeah.
All these
and
things.
You don't have the context.
You don't have the context. All these are exactly right. So you're bringing your own experience, and hopefully occasionally you say something useful, but often you're saying something that's just kind of what your own thing is, and management sort of discounts all this stuff. Anyway, but that had been good. But having said that, it was still a very interesting experience. I learned a lot. I hope I added some things, mostly around customer obsession. Come back to that in a little bit. Anyway, at the end of the prior year, John Zimmer and Logan Green, the co-founders of Lyft, had let the board know that it was time for them to step down. And it really was their decision. They came to the board and said, this is everything we've done since college. Company's gone through a lot of tough times. It's best for us to turn the reins over to someone else. So the board said, okay, we understand. They did the thing the boards do, form a committee, search committee. And I was not on that committee. So I was just a sort of distant observer to this. I was thinking about, other things and running my nonprofit and, living my life. Anyway, one day, as I say, Valentine's Day, my phone rings and Sean says, I have this offer. And I thought, okay, hold on. When the board chair calls you that, it's probably like he's going to ask me to be the head of the audit committee or some terrible thing like this. Something like, okay, what do you need me to do, big guy? And he said, no, actually, Logan, John, and I have been talking about this, and we think you would be potentially a great leader for this company, and you should consider throwing your hat in the ring. And I said, absolutely not. I mean, the first thing I said is I'm very flattered. It's very kind. And the second thing is there is no way. There's literally no way. In fact, you should hang up the phone right now because any second you're spending trying to convince me is just a wasted second. You know what I mean? And you got more important things to do. Like honestly. And he said, well, look, give it a little thought. And he actually said, if you want, like John and Logan and I can come over tonight and we can kind of have a conversation with you at your home and talk to you about it at length. And I was like, are you, like, it's Valentine's Day, dude. Like, I don't think, not only my wife would be upset, but maybe everyone's spouse would be a little upset with us. But anyway, I did find myself, bizarrely enough, and to answer your question directly now, after I hung up the phone, literally, I was taking a walk when I took this call. I literally said to myself, like out loud. And then I said it again, like maybe. And then one thing led to another, and I can tell you the story. But anyway, I got myself convinced that I should at least throw my hat in the ring. And then, to be honest, they said, just be clear, like you don't have the job. Like you have to interview for the job. And then I got competitive. Then I'm like, okay, I'm going to friggin' get this job.
Yeah. And was the candidate pool, what the 100 or so people that they were interviewing in January or February, was it more like, What types of candidates were in play for a job like this?
So it was an amazing slate, amazing. But here, and their names, I'm not going to name any of the individuals, but I will tell you these were people in general who had run significant sized, often public, almost always public companies in the tech space, and had grown them from X to 10X. Let's say that was sort of the overall schema of the thing. The problem I think that folks ran into is they looked at the job, and this is not me speaking, this is John and Logan telling me, the problem they were having is that the people who had done it before basically were saying, I've done this and it's really hard and I don't necessarily want to do it again.
Yeah.
It was amazing.
That's right.
And now I'm ready to do something else. And then the people who hadn't done it before weren't the right people. So who were excited about it. I mean, they weren't the right people. They hadn't done it before. So now, to be clear, I hadn't really done it before either. So, I have maybe some other qualities that were of interest. But anyway, that was, I think, the problem they were beginning to find is it's just that.
Yeah. And what is it? It's a year later.
Yeah, 14 months.
14 months within your first. So maybe just to paint the picture of what you walked into, the company had shed almost 90% of its market value since going public in 2019.
Yeah.
Within 2 weeks, you laid off almost a quarter of the company, which is not an insignificant amount. It's a tenth of the size of the other competitor.
Yeah.
Right. How long from when you took the job to when you actually started doing the job did the reality set in that, yes, it's cool that I'm the Lyft CEO. What a privilege and an honor. But holy shit, this is a serious job ahead of me.
Yeah. So, gosh, how can I answer that question? So the truth is, so I loved it from day one, and I still, and this is a cliche, but it is true, I jump out of bed every morning, can't wait to get to work. In fact, even on Saturdays, I turn to my wife and I say, gosh, I kind of wish it were Monday because I want to get back to it. She's like, David, settle down a little bit. So the second part of your question, or sort of the implicit thing is, gosh, this must both be hard and very, challenging. It is, but I am absolutely loving it. So now there have been hard parts. I'll come back to that also in a second. But in that first day, it was very interesting. So I started on April 17th. And I had for the prior couple of weeks been coming in on Thursdays and Fridays and just sort of trying a bit of a running start. But really the job started April 17th of last year. Okay, so what happens those first couple of days? So you're right. So I made a decision. This is actually a decision I made as I was coming in to lay off. It was actually 26% of the workforce, very significant. Now, and I made another decision, actually quite controversial at the time, to get people back in the office 3 days a week. It had been all remote, all the rest. And I made a decision to reduce stock-based compensation because it was frankly out of hand. So let's just say I was not Mr. Popularity coming in on day one.
Yeah, as a bit of a villain.
Yeah. And I actually very much remember an all hands meeting we had where basically someone laid these things out to me and said, like, remind me why we should be working here. Like, what? I'm having a hard time kind of seeing the good side of this. So anyway, but here's some other things I did. At 10 o'clock on the first day, after I got my computer and this and that, the other thing, I had a meeting where we talked about a new product, which we've now launched, called Women Plus Connect, which is about women riders and drivers being able to choose each other. Transformational product, but one that the company had struggled with for a long time. I said, we're absolutely going to do this. I had a very strong point of view right from the first day that we were going to be very focused on bringing people together. The loneliness epidemic, which we can again talk about, and you can't do that if you're not physically together. I had a very strong point of view, and we were going to lead with purpose. I had a very strong point of view that customer obsession, what was going to drive our profitable growth. Like that was a very strong point of view. And so for whatever reason, and I don't exactly know why, but I came in with a lot of conviction about certain things, that we had to cut costs because otherwise we couldn't price right, we couldn't pay right, that we had to start to build, we had to lead with purpose and all the rest. And when I put all those things together, I found it exhilarating, and I am happy to say, largely, although the company went through some very difficult times, the company has responded really, really well.
Yeah. Why did you did not just make those layoffs so that you could save money. You reinvested that money back into the business.
That's right.
Can you explain that?
Yeah.
Because I think it's an important point relative to what you see with most layoffs, which is we got to get back to profitability as fast as possible, which you are on the nice trajectory of doing. But you haven't done it just because of cost cutting.
That's right. So two things. The first, so my theory of the case is, to say it again, customer obsession drives profitable growth. That's my theory of the case. And so what does that mean? In the rideshare space, you cannot call yourself customer obsessed if you're not doing the basics right. What are the basics? Price right, pay your drivers right, pick people up on time. Those are the basics, right? You can't do that, and they're related. In other words, if you're not paying drivers right, you won't have enough drivers. If you don't have enough drivers, you can't get people picked up quickly. So So you have to get your, and remember again, we are in a two-player marketplace, and so if you are mispriced versus your competition, particularly your larger competition, you will start to lose share. So this was the context that I was looking at. I was looking at a company whose share was declining from say 30s to the mid 20s. I think when I joined, it was about 26% share. That's not good, and it was declining for a very clear reason, because we were mispriced and we were mispaying. And that also had service level implications, as I said. Okay, so you got to start there. You got to fix it. You got to get the right team. We'll come back to that, but then you got to make sure that you're doing the right thing for customers. In order to do the right thing for customers, you have to be able to afford it. In order to be able to afford it, we had to lose. It was about $330 million of cost. That was the cost that we had to make go away through a very painful process called a layoff, in order to be able to reinvest that in the business, largely in the form of better pricing and better pay. So that was kind of the beginning of,
better pay for the drivers.
Better pay for the drivers, better pricing for the riders.
Yeah.
Those are the basics. And then you can build on top of that in 1,000 ways. But if you don't do that, so it was a little bit of a kind of going back to first principles thing, and that's kind of where we started.
Yeah, that makes sense. When you talk, it doesn't surprise me that you spent whatever it was 5 or 6 years at Amazon, because you have a lot of Jeff in you. It doesn't surprise me. You two, you clearly have taken so many of the principles from Amazon and applied that to this company. And in some ways, they're very similar companies, but in other ways, they're very different. Anyway.
Yeah. I mean, there are several people in my life who've had an enormous influence. Jeff is absolutely one of them. And maybe at the top, well, I can't say at the top of the list because there are several people who would vie for that
and
spot.
And you were Bezos'
sure.
like right hand for, like, you were employee, what, 60 at Amazon?
37.
37.
Yeah.
And so you were one of the most senior people there.
Yeah. Yeah. I didn't know it at the time. I really did. I mean, at the time I joined, it was a $15.6 million bookstore. Part of the reason I joined is because I've loved reading all my life and I've loved technology. And so it was an amazing thing. And part was because of Jeff and the opportunity and so forth. But anyway, and my original job was vice president of new product development, which at the time meant everything that wasn't books. And then I ended up running the bookstore and marketing and all the rest. But
and you reported to Jeff.
Yeah. 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 For my whole time there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What surprised you about him?
What surprised me about Jeff Bezos? To answer that question, let me tell you the first real conversation we had. And it was over the telephone. I was working at Microsoft at the time, and my phone rang. Phone calls have made a big difference in my life, I guess.
Yeah.
Anyway, and it was this guy, Jeff, and he was doing a reference check. And this is of a person that I had worked with at Microsoft for many years, and she was applying. So this would have been in 1995. Okay, so Amazon was really just getting started, and he at the time was looking for his first vice president of marketing, and so he was doing a reference check. And what surprised me about that conversation, of course, I was surprised many times over the years, but I mean that was a particularly surprising conversation because here was the CEO of a company personally doing a reference check, and it took him 45 minutes. 45 minutes. And he was, this is a word he uses, relentless about, and disciplined actually would be a better word to use in this case. You could literally hear him with a piece of paper reading word for word every single question in exactly the same way that he'd clearly done it 50 times before so that he could have sort of comparability across candidates. And the question that he asked me that was the most startling question, because I thought it was so sort of revealing of his mindset, was, it's very clear you think highly of Leslie. This is the person that we were talking about who ended up joining the company. It's very clear you think highly of Leslie. Give me an example of a job for which she would not be a good candidate. And I thought it was such a good question because, of course, it's the question that allows you, as presumably a friend and an advocate for this person, because she had used me as her reference, to sort of say, well, maybe, if it's a super detail-oriented job, maybe she wouldn't be the right person or whatever it might be, So anyway, it made me realize, number one, he takes hiring very seriously. Number two, he's a very disciplined dude. Number three, he's a very smart guy who can ask you questions that get you to say things that you might not otherwise say in a way that will actually help him make a smart decision. That was that. Then we actually got to, talking and got to know each other a little bit, and one thing led to another. But that was the first of many surprises.
When at the time you were pretty senior at Microsoft.
Yeah, ish. I was running a product group, which at Microsoft is depending on your perspective, certainly depending on my perspective. Well, my perspective was I had been a junior marketing guy coming out of business school, and so it was a big job. If you look at the whole company, it wasn't super senior, but I had certainly had a lot of interactions with Bill. I was seen as a sort of up and coming guy, all these sorts of things. So yes, I guess.
What did Bill say when you left?
So it was a very interesting conversation. So again, literally a phone call comes onto my phone, and this is a landline. Again, this is a funny vision. But Bill would like to see you in his office, said his assistant. And when those calls happen, you hustle your butt over to
run to Bill Gates' office.
You go quite quickly.
Yeah,
quite quickly. So, and it was clear, pardden me, at that point I think a little more context they gave me. He would like to talk to you about the decision that you're, in the process of making.
It was known.
Like it was known at that point. It was known. It was known. So Bill calls me into his office, and after approximately 7 seconds of chit chat, no, I take that back. After 0 seconds of chit chat, that's not right. He gets to it, and he says basically what is going on, and I tell him a little bit about Amazon and a little bit about my own passion for reading and a little bit about Jeff and a little bit about the opportunity and so on and so forth. And then he says, and he is quite a thing. He actually says a couple of things. I've said some of these in the past. One I haven't, which I'll tell you in a second. He said, look, you mean to tell me that you were leaving Microsoft, where you were doing super well, to go join some tiny little internet bookstore that nobody's ever heard of? That has got to be the stupidest decision I have ever heard anyone make in his life. Which, of course, is a badge of honor, in a sense, to be told you're the stupidest person in the world. But I also found it was such an interesting reaction because, truthfully, it might have been true. In other words, it might have been a stupid decision. I didn't know, but what I did know is I thought the internet was going to be a big deal, like kind of duh, although 1996, I guess maybe not so obvious, but anyway, pretty clear. Number two, I knew reading was a big deal for me, important. Number three, I thought technology was pretty cool. Number four, I thought Jeff was pretty cool. So he was sort of arguing in a way that wasn't actually landing with me. So that was that.
Yeah.
And then there was a little bit of a you'll never work in this town again vibe going on after that. That was kind of
like a scorch the earth.
A little bit. He said people think when they leave, not that many people at the time left Microsoft to go do something else professional. People in the 1990s, they would leave Microsoft, but often they had become very wealthy and they went and kind of did semi-retirement. So it wasn't a very common thing for people to leave for, even if it wasn't a competitor, but it was still a different company. Anyway, he said something to the effect of, when people leave Microsoft, sometimes they think that like the relationship they have with me will continue and that I will continue. And he said basically, don't count on it.
Yeah.
Like, okay.
But that's the Microsoft culture, isn't it?
That's right.
Like that's Bill.
Yeah.
That was Steve Ballmer.
And then Steve Ballmer called me in his office a couple of days later and was banging a basketball on the ground and going bananas. He was total Steve. In fact, I actually felt a little bad for him just because he had just gotten off a plane from Japan, coming back from Japan. And it was clear he was the guy whose job was to save me, right? Like Bill tried and didn't quite work and whatever, but it was sort of a first effort. Then Steve's job was like, okay, whatever it friggin' takes, get this guy Risher to, come to his senses and not do it. And like he literally, like he's throwing a basketball around the room, just bam, bam, bam. Total Ballmer. And I'm like, unfortunately, you know what? I've already made my decision.
And like, maybe this is going to be a hard question for you to answer, but like what you after Princeton, you went to Harvard, then you went to Microsoft. Like that was your first real job.
Yeah.
And you were in your mid 20s, basically.
Right. Yep.
What do you think, that strikes me as atypical that Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer would care at all about a mid 20-year-old that had no professional experience previous to Microsoft. Mm-hmm. What do you think they saw that was rising in your star?
Well, you're right. That's a tricky question.
Like, why do you think they were so hell-bent? And by the way, Microsoft wasn't some Joe Schmo company at that point.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, we had launched Windows 95. I mean, it was of course, it was significant. So this.
Or what do you think you did that caught their attention?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think. I can tell you some things that people have told me.
Yeah.
One was And
by the way, I have a suspicion. Sorry to interrupt. That whatever you're going to say. There's a pattern that repeats throughout. Maybe it's not a thing, but a way that you approach things.
Okay, I'll be interested in this in what we sort of learn about me, I guess, over this conversation. I tell you, there are a couple things that I know stood out for other people because they mentioned them to me often enough that it was remarkable, I guess. One was so I was an intern at Microsoft, to be clear, before I full time. I between my 2 years at business school. And I came in to a product group that really barely existed. It was a database product group. At the time, it was called Microsoft Cirrus. That was the code name for what became Microsoft Access, the Windows database. And my job over the course of the summer was to go and literally sit next to people who were using, at the time, competing products, DBase, well, potentially competing products, DBase, Paradox, RBase. These are products that have long since disappeared from the face of the earth. And my job was to watch people and ask them questions and then come back and basically write up summaries of what I'd seen and where the opportunity could be for us. And I will tell you that this again was a summer internship sort of thing, that those missives, because they would be sort of multi-page pieces of email, made it all the way to Bill. And is an intern. And part of it, and through a guy named Adam Bosworth, who's a fairly famous guy, a guy named Todd Nielsen, who was my boss over the summer. Anyway, and And what people said is you have a remarkable way for both being a very good observer, a very good listener, but also very insightful about what it is that people are doing and are not doing and want to be doing and so forth and so on. And then you also happen to be a good writer, which makes it easy, even as a CEO or a senior person in the company, to understand the point. So there was some combination of all those things that clearly caught people's attention. The second thing I will say is I am a driven person. And I think that comes across, and it I think was obvious to them as they looked at my trajectory through coming back and joining the Access team, and then a couple of years later running that product group, then starting a new group called Microsoft Investor, which was an early web-based product that still exists, kind of money management, investment management tool. And in both of those cases, I think they saw maybe grit is the word that you would use. I might use a word like, tenacity or focus, or not just focus, drive. And I think the combination of drive plus customer empathy was very interesting to them.
Why are you driven?
So I think about this from time to time, and I can give you at least
It's not
answer.
money.
No,
Not now.
It's not.
Not now. You don't join Amazon at employee 36 and worry about money later on in life.
And it never has been, actually. That's a whole separate story. In fact, my wife writes about this in a book that she wrote about money and impact and so forth, and never been my focus. No, it has to do with, as I think so many things do, my parents and their values. And I'll tell you a little story there. And I know we're covering a lot of ground in a lot of different ways. Let me tell you a little story that I think for me does actually, it sort of is emblematic, let's say. So my father was African American. He died many years ago. My mother was white. The two of them met in, of all places, Korea in 1963. They were both sort of involved in the military. My father was in the military on a ROTC scholarship, paying off his student loan debt at law school. And my mother was effectively a candy striper, effectively a Red Cross volunteer. So she was a Red Cross volunteer. Okay. So the two of them meet. They happen to both be from Maryland, D.C. area, completely coincidentally, but they meet overseas. Now, when you are and he was in the military, she was in the Red Cross. They fell in love. This caused an enormous amount of stress. It caused them professional stress, right? Her Red Cross unit, let's say, thought that she was bringing shame to the unit because she was involved in a military man, but also because she was involved with an African-American man. It caused enormous problems with both of their families, who just were dead set against it. Let's remember, in much of the country, it was actually illegal for a white man and a black woman certainly to get married, in some states, even to have a relationship. But despite all of those things, they just did it. They're like, we are in love. We are going to have this relationship, not maybe just because we are in love, but almost despite the fact that everyone is telling us we can't do this. And that was part of what became, frankly, very motivational for them. So they ended up getting married. They had to do it in New York, not the DC area. Very few of their friends came. None of their families came, so on and so forth. To be honest, the relationship didn't last that long. It only lasted for about 6 years after that. Separate story. But I do believe both of them, both separately and sort of collectively, although I didn't know them that well when they were married, funnily enough. But anyway, they taught me a sense of just friggin' relentless. Like, once you decide to do something, you will do this thing. And I have a lot of examples in my life where I realize I have called on that same sense of drive.
Do you have a relationship? Did you have a relationship with both of them?
I did. Very different sort of relationship. So they both passed away now. My mother was really the one who raised me. She and my brother and I, the three of us, in a very small, 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom, very, very small house in Maryland. So anyway, so I have a very, very deep relationship with my brother, of course, who I just saw 2 nights ago, but also with, it's his birthday today, by the way, but also with my mother, because she was really sort of the force, but also with my father, who was, he lived 4.5 miles away. He was a much more complicated, well, they were both complicated. I had a more complicated relationship with him, sometimes very uncomfortable relationship with him, but yes, I did.
I've heard you say, if you don't want to talk about it, no problem, but that you had a very unpleasant conversation with your father at some point in your life, and that's where you learned the value of being straightforward. Are you willing to share that?
It's interesting you bring that up. It's a story I've told very few times, so it's impressive research that you uncovered that one. Yeah. I can tell it because, enough time has passed. And yeah. So I'll be brief. The way, if you are the child of divorced parents, maybe you have some understanding of the dynamic where you spend some time with one parent and some time with the other. In our case, my brother's in my case, we would spend the weeks with with our mother, and then every other weekend we would spend it with my father. So, and his wife, my stepmother, who's still very much alive. So, this is difficult. It's difficult structurally, right? Because you sort of are in this transition mode. You have maybe different friends, different environment. It's complicated. Not impossible to deal with, but there's some complexity that happens. But when you're maybe 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, you roll with it, right? What choice do you have as a 9-year-old? When you start to get in your teens, however, you have maybe a different sense of your own agency. Whether or not you want to be doing this is maybe comes to the fore. So one evening, I was maybe 13, 14, something like that. I kind of announced to my father Friday night after I got to his house that I wouldn't be spending the weekend with him. And he, I think, ignored it, truthfully, because, he thought it was just whatever 14-year-old saying whatever it does. So anyway, at the end of our dinner, which was a pleasant enough dinner, I kind of let him know that I would be leaving at that point. And again, they sort of ignored me. I think they'd sort of gone upstairs and whatever. And so I walked out the front door and proceeded to walk 4.5 miles back to my mother's place. Now, at maybe 10 o'clock on a Friday night. This was very unexpected. And so when my father realized what had happened, he got very upset. And it took him some time. I don't really know. Again, this is back, before cell phones and so forth. Now, my mother was not actually in town. I was actually, my mother traveled a lot for business. And so some people were staying at our house as kind of babysitters, minders, you might say. Anyway, I get back to my house. I walk in the front door. They're sort of surprised, but they're kind of the types of people who are like, I'll just roll with this. That's all fine. He's 14 years old. He's whatever, young adult. He can make his own decisions. And that was that. So then my father drives up and he is livid. Like you can't imagine a person more angry than my father was at that moment. And my father, he could be temperamental, but in general, he's a very even-keeled guy. But at this point, he was the opposite. So anyway, at this point, I was actually upstairs and I see him just roll up the front steps and basically come in and demand that I come downstairs to these people who are staying at our house. And I did. And he basically dragged me out the front door and dragged me downstairs, the front stairs of our house. And it was a very, very physical and very, very unpleasant moment. Very, very unpleasant moment. Such that the police ended up coming and so forth and so on. I ended up staying, by the way. I ended up prevailing, you might say. But he was very upset. And most of the reason I prevailed wasn't just because of me, because literally the police took him away and said, you have to leave now. Okay. So that's very, very unpleasant. Now, what you're referring to was my reflection afterwards, where I'm thinking to myself, why was he so angry? And the reason he was so angry was not just that I had sort of defied him. To be clear, I hadn't really defied him. He hadn't really laid down any particular law. It was, I really hadn't been straightforward with him. When I said I was going, let's be honest, I was kind of whispering it. Mm-hmm. I wasn't kind of waving a flag. I wasn't saying I want to have a confrontation about this. I was basically saying I'm out of here. And then even when he came up, I'm not sure I've actually told this part of the story before, but even when he came up to the front door of my house in Maryland, our house, I was literally upstairs and I was looking out the window, and it took me a good 30 seconds to get the courage up to come downstairs, as opposed to literally as he's walking out, towards the thing, to come out and confront him and have this conversation. And it was the two of those things, that overall feel, and I understood this, I really did. He was angry, not just at what I had done, but at how I dealt with it. Hadn't been straightforward with him when I left, hadn't been ready to kind of confront, maybe take responsibility, let's say, for the decision when he rolled up. And while I can defend myself, I can also say, I kind of got it. He was just super pissed and expressing himself in the way that he kind of knew how.
Yeah. And as a result of that, thanks for sharing.
Sure.
And by the way, I know the feeling of splitting houses and going back and forth from mom and dad's, and it is uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. When you're a confused getting into teenage years kid, there's quite a bit of chaos in your mind, and these types of things exacerbate that. Mm-hmm. and they're often like two very different places.
Yeah.
And both literally, they just are. The rules are different, but in your mind, they're different places. It's almost like two different lives, And your comment about like, yeah, usually if I would go to dad's, like my friends aren't coming over to my dad's, for example. My friends are in a different town with my mom. The rules are just different, and I found that like often the burden ends up being on you to figure out how to balance those worlds, and in some way you almost feel guilt that you have different rules, and you don't want to out one to the other. You don't want to make one feel bad. You know that they're highly sensitive to the situation, and so you don't want to make it any worse. It's not easy. It's not easy.
It sounds like you have personal experience here, and it's not easy.
Yeah.
It's and I think you've articulated it beautifully.
When you think about your drive as it relates to your parents, like how do you? So I understand the clarity that you found on candor and directness. Where do you think, like, if I could just like peel one more layer behind that on the drive, like, do you have a sense of why you're so determined? If it's not money, where that determination continues to be fueled by?
I'm not sure I have a great answer to that. I will tell you, I mentioned my brother a minute ago. I can tell you a little story there, which I just experienced this a couple of nights ago. So my brother, I mentioned it's his birthday. My birthday was a couple of days ago. So he's 2 years and 2 days younger than I am. He and I have, of course, known each other all my life. Actually, I take that back, all his life. Anyway, exactly. And I've had an understanding of him. And he's a very accomplished person, right? To be very clear, you mentioned the schools I went to. He went to equally impressive schools. As a lawyer, he's been very successful. He's a public defender for many years, worked for the ACLU for many years. Very, very successful. He was, 6 weeks ago, enrobed as a judge. And I could not be prouder of him, but that's not the story. When I watched his ceremony, and then when he and I went out to dinner 2 nights ago with our wives, I saw something in him that I had literally never seen before, which was just a passion, a sort of a sparkling eye, just unbelievable level of enthusiasm for work itself, not the law, which he's been interested in for many years, not let's say defending people who are in difficult circumstances, which he's done for many years, but the thing itself, the job of being a judge, sitting on that bench. I actually gave him a powdered wig, which was highly entertaining. And honest to God, he put it on and he was just grinning from ear to ear.
Oh, I love that.
Right? Spectacular moment. And so anyway, there is something in me that did not exist in him until it was sort of revealed to me, and I think to him, 6 weeks ago, about loving the work. And I love what I'm creating. I love the people I'm doing with. I love the customer obsession and the focus I have. But there is also something about just the work itself, and I'm talking about work with a capital W, like all that that I find incredibly energizing.
When you joined Amazon, what was the state of affairs there?
Well, it was a $15.6 million bookstore, as I said, in 1996.
You were in Seattle.
I was in Seattle, exactly right. Started work there, I think, end of January, probably January 30th or so, 1997.
They gave you a door as a desk.
They gave me a door as a desk. Yes, they did. Funnily enough, and that is a true story, absolutely, and that still exists. They also, interesting enough, put a little box of like pencils and pens on my desk, which I found actually quite interesting. I was like, oh, this is interesting. Like I must be a real person now. I get like a little desk thing, whatever. Anyway, so I had no idea what I was doing, to be very clear, because the company was focused on books, and my job nominally was figure out what to do beyond books, right? That was sort of the mandate, right? Like, what should we open a music store? Should we open a video store? Should we open a toy store? Now, I will say within about 24 hours, it became very clear that I wasn't going to get to do that job just yet, because it turns out we had a very aggressive competitor, Barnes & Noble. You may have heard of them. And they were extremely focused on putting us out of business. And so while the bookstore was growing quickly, and quite quickly, as is well documented, we also had a competitor who was just, dead set against our existence. And then the company, by the way, was not public, but we were also thinking at that point we would go public sometime later that year. That ended up being in April of that year. And so there were a number of things that we really had to get settled in terms of all sorts of things. And so my first real job there was, and this sounds so kind of quaint now, but the catalog had 1 million books, which was a big number compared to a Barnes & Noble physical store, but a small number compared to the number of books in the world, physically being published every year. And so we launched, and it was really kind of my first big project, an out-of-print books thing, which was complicated and a whole thing. But anyway, so short story is, it was a company that was growing quickly, losing just buckets of money, but understandably so. Like, it was still very early in its growth, and already in a desperate, kind of contest for, not dominance per se, but just for survival against a very, very aggressive competitor.
And you spent, 6 years there?
Yeah.
And by the way, I mean, obviously we have a long history with Amazon. The company was getting ripped at that point.
Yeah.
Like when it went public, it was not some darling.
Correct.
Like, the company was getting absolutely ripped. When you left, Bezos wrote a very nice note on your behalf, and he left an Easter egg. Mm-hmm. Is it still there?
It is.
Can you describe this?
Yes. So this was one of the 10 least expected things in my life. So a couple weeks before I left, I'll give you a tiny bit of context. So I had told Jeff that there was time for me to go. And he said, David, that's nuts. Like, that makes no sense. It wasn't like quite a stupidest decision I've ever heard type conversation, because it wasn't sort of aggro in quite that way. But it was more along the lines of, David, let me just make sure you understand something. Like, if I got hit by a bus, you would be running this company. And I said, well, Jeff, that's extremely kind, and I appreciate your saying that. By the way, my life goal is not for you to be hit by a bus. I don't want to sit around and wait for that. And anyway, you're doing a great job, and I got other things I want to do in my life. So anyway, that was the context. It took about 6 months or so to leave, and it was a whole thing. About let's say 6 days before I left, again, my phone rings. I can't believe I'm saying this for the third time in one interview, but literally it does. And it is Jeff saying, I have a couple questions for you. What are some of your favorite books? What are some of your favorite movies? What are some of your favorite, songs? And I'm like, okay, sure, I can answer these questions. And I'm like, what's up? And he's like, oh, I'm just, whatever, working on a thing. But cool, okay, fine. So then the last all hands meeting comes on one of my final days at the company. And Jeff stands up and does kind of his thing. And then he says, before I finish, I just want to share something with you, the audience of all, I don't forget how many people were at the company at that point. And so he pushes a button. He actually goes to a very particular point on the website, which is kind of a hidden thing, and clicks a hidden link. And then up pops this Easter egg, which, for those of you who don't know, many people do, would be sort of a hidden part, in this case, of the website, the Amazon website. And the Easter egg says something, and I'm not going to get this right, but it says something along the lines of, David, you're part of the DNA of this company, and we couldn't have done what we've done without you, or something along these lines. Very kind. And then he says two things which are even more meaningful. He says the first thing is, this website, or this Easter egg, will live in perpetuity on the Amazon website. He's made good on that promise. It's still there. It's hard to find, and it's degraded slightly, but it's still there. Number one. And then number two, he said, and as David, of course, wouldn't have it any other way, this page has links to many of David's favorite products, because every page has to be selling. I was a big, always be selling, always be closing, retail's detail guy. And so then it has a list of all the different products that he talked about as kind of my favorite products, and that's it.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
How long were you there for?
It was 6 years. So I think I'm going to get this right. So I joined in 1997 at the beginning, and I left at the beginning of 2022. 2022. What am I saying? 2002. Thank you.
And where did you go?
I went to the University of Washington to teach at the business school.
And I guess why? Like
Yeah.
I guess at that time you'd done so much of the heavy lifting. 5 years later,
Right.
obviously there's still so much opportunity ahead of you there.
Mm-hmm.
What weren't you getting from the company?
Yeah, nothing. I was getting everything from the company. The company was amazing. It was amazing. So it really wasn't that. It was. Okay, I guess it was, but in maybe a different sense from the way I thought I heard the question. It was more, what else is out there? What else is out there? So I think this is actually advice I got from my mother many, many years ago. She said something along the lines of, this was a particular moment where I was actually deciding whether or not to go to Microsoft, and I was evaluating, this was out of business school, whether or not to do that or to do something else, which would have placed me physically closer to my girlfriend at the time, who was someone that I was very fond of, had a very good relationship with, and it was a difficult decision because Seattle was a long way away from where she was, which was Chicago. Anyway, and her basic point was, if you spend energy thinking about what you're leaving behind, you will never do anything. You have to think about what's next. You can accommodate, you can think about, you can take account of what you're leaving behind, but you have to think of what's next if you're going to sort of do anything in life. And this was the same sort of thing. Like, I had been at Amazon through an incredible time. I had learned an unbelievable amount. I mean, it made my 2 years of business school look like, sort of elementary school compared to what you learn, 5-6 years working at a company like Amazon, helping it grow and so on and so forth. Learning from Jeff, learning from my peers, by the way, having 2 daughters, managing my whole life, all this stuff. And it wasn't like I thought I had nothing more to learn. My God, no. But it was, hold on, there's this itch that I've wanted to scratch ever since I was in 8th grade, which is at some day I want to teach. And while I'm sure I could be at Amazon for the next 3, 5, 10, 20 years, frankly, when I was growing up, I never particularly dreamed of being the CEO of a Fortune 500 company, not particularly, but I absolutely dreamed about teaching and being in a university setting or whatever. And so I thought to myself, you know what, it's time to go do that. And it's kind of that simple. And then I got a great opportunity to teach a course called Competing on the Internet, which was perfect, hand in glove. And I will say, not only did I enjoy it, I was elected professor of the quarter. The first quarter I taught the course, and professor of the year, the first full year I taught the course. And the reason I say that is not just to brag, although I guess it is a little braggy, but also to say, like, I was good at it. And I thought maybe that was going to be true. And that was, again, super satisfying to me.
Did you not miss the adrenaline of company building?
I did. Yeah. So I tried to run a marathon. It actually didn't work out. I injured myself in training. I came up with other ways.
You were finding other avenues to push your envelope.
That's right. Including teaching, which doesn't necessarily sound like a challenging thing from the outside, but I ripped up the syllabus. I remade it with entirely, using HBS case studies. I did all these sorts of things. And so while it's not adrenaline-y even in quite the same way, there is a certain thing of, walking into a room at 8:30 in the morning and having 30 people look at you and say, like, okay, what do we got today? and frankly, making it up because I'd never done anything like this before. So while it doesn't give you that same rush in a certain way, there's another very satisfying, like, I'm creating this whole thing. I'm creating this course out of whole cloth, didn't exist before, and hopefully changing people's lives.
Do you still stay in touch with Jeff?
I do. Yeah. Not regularly, to be honest.
He's living a good life right now.
He's got a lot going on. He's living a pretty good life. He's living a pretty good time. My last conversation with him actually was 2 weeks before I took the Lyft job. Yeah. I had reached out to him, and we arranged for a phone conversation, and I really wanted to tell him how much I appreciated all I had learned from him, and how it had set me up from Amazon and for Lyft, but from my days working, and how I sort of hoped I was kind of doing him proud would be a little bit of a strong statement, but something like that.
Carrying on the DNA from Amazon into the world and doing positive things.
Exactly.
Had you already accepted the job when you called him?
I had.
What did he say? Did he opine on the job?
He said, well, of course, congratulations. Very kindly, he said, I don't know much about Lyft or Lyft's board, but I now know one thing, which is that they have excellent judgment. It's very
nice,
kind thing to say. We talked a little bit about the dynamics of the business, and he paid attention to rideshare sort of back in the day, but not for a while. So we kind of had a little conversation about that. It was his, and then he told me a little bit about Blue Origin and what he was focused on. It was really like that. It was kind of more about catching up than anything else. The words that probably sort of stick in my mind the most are about his point about the board, which is very kind.
And Ariel's on the board from
Ariel Cohen
from Navan.
Yeah,
what a great guy.
Oh, super guy.
Like, what a great guy.
Yeah,
and he loves you. I actually had dinner last night with his right hand at Navan.
Oh,
and I was telling him how he Lyft bike to dinner, by the way.
Oh, nice.
He Lyft bikes everywhere. He's
awesome.
hooked.
I'm loving everything you're saying here.
He's hooked.
Amazing.
And he lives in Hayes Valley or something, and he went to Russia. I was like, what? Anyway.
E-bikes, baby.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. And I was telling him how we're going to have a conversation today, and he was like, oh, yeah, Ariel loves him. So anyway.
It's nice.
It is a good board.
Ariel said since you bring him up, I love Ariel as well. He's quite a character, and he's got a very, very clearly articulated and sort of felt management style, which in some ways is maybe similar to mine. In many ways, it's also quite different. One of the very nice things Ariel said to me some time ago is he said, after I became CEO, he said, I have to tell you this, David, and I don't think I'm betraying a confidence, is one of the reasons I'm staying on this board is because I really enjoy watching you as a leader and learning from you as a leader. And I feel the same way about him. Like, as I say, we have some overlap, but probably more different than similar. It's fun to kind of duke it out a little bit.
That's awesome. Yeah, he's definitely not shy.
That's for sure.
Yeah. Before I skip back to Lyft, how long did you teach for?
I taught for 2 years.
And what did you do in the time from teaching to Lyft?
So, a couple of things. And to answer the question, I have to back up just a tiny bit. So in 2001, so now this is the year before I left Amazon, my wife and I, who at the time had very young children, very, very young children, sat down and had a very interesting and important conversation. We had met at Microsoft, and so we both came from sort of that world, and we were sort of reflecting over dinner about how at a company like Microsoft you would make a 5-year plan or something like this, and we thought to ourselves, like maybe we should make a 5-year plan for our family. What would that look like? And so we talked about that a little bit, and really for both of us, one thing rose to the top of the list for quite different reasons, and it was let's move overseas, and in particular, let's take our kids overseas so that they can see the world from a different perspective. This is never something that I grew up with. I grew up with that opportunity was not available to me. But for my wife, who had lived a couple of years in London with her family because of her father's job, it was very sort of formative for her, and it was sort of aspirational for me. So anyway, we decided to do it. And we sort of plotted out that sometime over the next 5 years, we would do it. So the answer to your question then is we did that. We executed on that plan. So in 2004, we decided to leave the United States for what we thought was going to be a single year. We moved to Barcelona with, at the time, our still quite young children. They were sort of entering into kindergarten and second grade at the time. One thing led to another, and we ended up spending 7 years outside the United States, living primarily in Barcelona. Now, that in and of itself is a whole thing, right? I was on the school board. There was kind of a turnaround situation. I did actually teach at Asade Business School off and on while I was there. I learned Spanish, which is very interesting. I learned Catalan, which is very interesting. I learned how to play the Spanish guitar, which is very interesting. We did a lot of traveling with the kids, all these different things that you do when you're an expat. And then, to make what could be quite a long story short, at another point in my life, during that time, about 4 years in, side story, I had fallen off my bike. I broke my collarbone. I broke a bunch of ribs, all these different things. And so I was on Vicodin. This idea sort of crystallized in my wife's and my head one evening when I was kind of high on opioids, that we should maybe spend the year traveling around the world with our kids. So we sort of kicked it up a notch. So you asked early in the conversation about, was sort of biking across the United States an outlier. And this for me is sort of another example. Like, why? Let's not just move overseas for a couple of months. Let's do it for a year. Let's do it for many years. Let's not just take a little trip to pick a country. Let's travel around the world for a year. Like, I don't know why, but anyway, I'm a little wired like that. So back to the story. We spent an entire year traveling around the world. We visited 19 different countries. We spent some long periods of time. For example, in China, we spent 2 months teaching English. For example, and going down the Yangtze River and doing other things. In other places, we spent just a couple of days. But it was always a blend of teaching our kids, because we were road schooling them, doing something sort of in the give backy, kind of sound, type of thing, something that was kind of like that, and then just exploring. Okay, now fast forward to the end of the trip, last part of the trip, Ecuador, going to the Galapagos Islands. If you've ever been to the Galapagos, you know that Guayaquil, Ecuador is the port city where you leave from, and we were visiting an orphanage on the day before we left for the Galapagos because a friend asked us to go. And so we did. I promise I'm getting the answer. As we end this day at an orphanage, we look at a building. I look at a building as we're literally exiting, and the building has a big padlock on it. And I kind of come to a halt. And I asked the woman who ran the orphanage, why is that building locked up and what's going on there? And she said, well, that's our library. And I said, what? And she said, look, the books take forever to get here. They come by boat. They're often out of date by the time they get here, or they were somebody else's trash books, some encyclopedia from 1972 they didn't want. And I said, okay, that sounds pretty bad. And remember, I've kind of alluded to this, like I was a reader as a kid. Reading has been important to me in many ways growing up. So anyway, I said, can we take a look inside? And she said, you know what, David, I think we've lost the key to that place. And when I heard that, this really was one of these moments in life where everything changes. I'm thinking about, why did I leave Microsoft to go to Amazon as a bookstore? I'm thinking of my two daughters, both of whom have Kindles, which we use. These are the first generation, actually second generation, very old school clunky devices, but we use them as we traveled around the world to read with them. I'm thinking of the friends I have and the relations I have with people at Amazon who still work on Kindle. I'm thinking of the importance of reading to myself in my life in many ways. Anyway, I'm thinking of a conversation I had with a friend named Colin about maybe using Kindles to get kids reading around the world, and it all crystallized. So the real answer to your question is, I started a nonprofit with Colin. The goal, it's called Worldreader, still exists today. Its goal is to get kids reading all around the world. And today, but digitally, all using Kindles originally and then cell phones later. And today we have about 22 million kids or people who have read on the platform since its beginning. And that absorbed my life and really took over my life for about 12 years.
And what did you give away? Did you give Kindles to communities that just couldn't get books?
So the model has evolved as these things do. At first, exactly. At first, it literally was go raise money, figure out, beg, borrow, and steal Kindles, even actually from Steve Kessel, who's the original kind of general manager of Kindle, who worked for me for years before. Anyway, he gave us a small number of Kindles to start with. Then we got some secondhand things. Then we raised money. We bought thousands of these things. And yes, we would put them we would do a couple of things really importantly. Number one, we wouldn't just give raw Kindles. We would load them with books. What books were on those Kindles? They were not just international books. They were local books. We have relationships with hundreds of local publishers, tiny little publishers you've never heard of from Ghana, from Kenya, now from India, now from Peru, now from the Middle East. Tiny, because it was very important to us that the kids reading read about themselves. We say that books have to be mirrors before they're windows, right? You got to see yourself as a 6-year-old. You can't be reading about, Curious George or whatever, who looks like a different thing, or maybe, I don't know, Berenstain Bears or something like this. Pick your favorite, kids book. Goodnight Moon, because it doesn't look like your world, right? So it had to be local books. So that was number one. Number two, we wanted to partner and still do with local communities, often through schools, sometimes through libraries, because we didn't want to be the sort of the Western guys that came in and parachuted with technology and random stuff. No, so we would do very, very deep partnerships with the Kenya National Library Service or the Ghanaian School Service, or whatever it might be. So local partnerships and local content, international technology. And we raised money for all this and then put them in kids' heads, and then did a lot of training and capacity building, particularly among teachers and librarians, to get the kids to use these things.
And where were you living?
So at the time we were living in Barcelona. We decided after this round the world trip, rather than re-enter the United States at that point, that Barcelona was actually a better place to start this nonprofit because it was closer to Africa, which was kind of our major focus at the beginning. And frankly, and this is like a weird pro tip, and like anyone listening to this, I guarantee it's a winner of an idea. Start a company, particularly like if it's a nonprofit or purpose-driven company, because anyway, in a place where there are a lot of expats. Why? Because where there are expats, there's talent that punches way above its weight. There may be trailing spouses. whatever. And people who are expats, they come for a certain reason. Again, let's say it's a trailing spouse. Let's say your wife has a new job at a bank or whatever, and in Paris, and you're the husband. You're like, well, what am I going to do? So for the first couple of months, you learn French, you do this, you take your kids to school, whatever, and then eventually you start to think, gosh, what else can I do? And the answer is, well, there's not that much else you can do because you're kind of stuck. You don't have work permit, all the rest. But you're an incredibly accomplished person, let's say. So anyway, I tapped into the local expat community. These are people, friends of my kids, parents and tennis partners of my wife and all these different people. And we kind of pulled together this kind of crazy band of, wacky lunatics who then spent the next, many, many years working very, very, very hard because I'm a high standards kind of guy. But anyway, and I think it scratched the itch of a lot of different people who are looking for a sense of purpose and how to put their brain and their passion to work.
So cool. What an amazing story.
Thank you.
And did you think that was going to be your lifelong journey?
I mean, if you'd asked me at the beginning, I would have said, I have no idea. Like so many things in life. I mean, in retrospect, things look one way. Prospectively, they look differently. I just thought I was putting one foot in front of the other, right? That we had this kind of cool idea, and that because of a certain set of characteristics that I had and relationships I had and drive I had and passion I had, whatever, that we would sort of do this thing. Then I found myself in Ghana, and of all these kind of crazy places, a country I'd never been to before, I'd frankly barely heard of before we started spending time there, and got very interested, not just in the local culture, but also in trying to do things in a part of the world, which a lot of other people think is difficult. And anyway, kind of solving those sets of problems. So like so many things, one thing led to another, led to another, led to another. And before I knew it, it really had just completely taken over my life, as well as everyone working for us. At the time, we might have had 10 to 15 to 20 people, working for us. It got up to 50 or 60, kind of at its high. But anyway, so maybe 3 to 4 to 5 years in, I might have said, yes, this is going to be what I do for the rest of my life. But who knows? 10 years in, I was like, okay, I guess this is what I'm doing the rest of my life. That's kind of it. And then this call came and from Lyft and changed everything.
And so it was literally the Lyft call that pulled you out of this.
It was. And it was the single biggest reason why I said, back to that, no. Because at that time, I really did think this is not just my legacy. I mean, that's kind of a ridiculous word, but it's just how I've organized my entire life. I go for the prior couple of years, of course, COVID messed things up, obviously, but for the prior couple of years, my wife and I would go to, let's say London, where we had a small office, and work out of there for, 5 weeks and get to know the staff there. Then we would go to Ghana for, a couple of weeks, or maybe go to Kenya or India. We would go to some of Worldreader's offices around the world, really live there, embed ourselves with that kind of local office, get to know people from a different way, obviously do the Worldreader work, raise funds, do all the things. And so it had become not just a passion and not just sort of a, something important for the world, I hope. I think reading really is quite important, but also really the way we organized our whole life. So imagine now, this company that you've given personally, thousands of hours, a lot of money personally, raised a lot of money, all these different things, personally met with, the prime minister of Tanzania, like it's, and then it also becomes almost your social and kind of life platform. Imagine getting a phone call saying, I have a different idea. Yeah, that was hard to leave behind.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Is it true that since you've joined Lyft, the stock has grown 80%? Is that right?
It has gone up. I mean, I think when I joined, the stock was sort of 9, 10. It got up to about 20. Now it's back maybe 13, something like this, 14, bounces around. It's done very well. Our investors are much happier now than they were, not just because of the stock price, which is always a kind of a funny thing and not super well correlated with the day-to-day, obviously, not even, or even the month-to-month. But our investors now see a great team working together. They see a vision and they see us executing. If you look at our growth quarter over quarter, maybe it was 10% the first quarter I was there was 17%, there was 20%, there was 22%, there's back to 17%, maybe now it's 15%, it'll be up, like these sorts of things. So it's growing and it's growing profitably. We're actually, we've been free cash flow positive for 2 quarters in a row now. I can't obviously tell you all about our future, but we are on a good trajectory. So I'm feeling really good about the company's both customer performance, which is what's driving our growth, as well as our investors are feeling.
How do you know what metric matters? Like in a marketplace business that's a public company that has all these different stakeholders, drivers, riders, investors, employees. What how do you measure what matters?
Rides is the answer. And it's reductive, as it has to be, but it's the
number of rides.
Number of rides.
Absolute value of rides on the platform every day.
100%. So if we do,
but can't you manipulate that by just lowering prices?
Sure, but so I would say profitable rides, but I would say, but economically viable rides, but even that's a little funny. That's why I'm going to go just back to rides. Of course you can, but then you can drive yourself out of business and then you don't have a company anymore. So I always think about, like, what are you sort of trying to maximize and what are your constraints? So your constraint is profitability as a public company. You can't have an unprofitable public company over the long term. It's like a law of physics. So therefore, so yes, of course you can. You can drop price and you can take unprofitable rides. That would be a very stupid idea in the long term. The company's experimented with that in the past. I don't recommend it. But broadly speaking, as long as you said as a constraint, we are going to make money. We have a certain, we have a margin goal that we've put out to the investment community, roughly, a little bit over 2%. Anyway, that's a constraint. So you can't not do that. But if you look at rides every single day, what you realize is the more rides that happen, the better. Why? Because every ride first is a happy rider. Second of all, every ride is also, if you do things right, a happy driver because they just made money. Third of all, every ride is someone getting out in the community and doing something important to them. So that's good because the best companies are the ones that are built on things that are really deeply important to people. And visiting friends, going out to a movie, getting to your job, going to visit your grandmother, whatever it is, you've helped something really important happen. Fourth of all, our business is a scale business. It's a scale business, right? So like we have a certain fixed cost base. It's lower now than it was when I joined for the reasons we talked about before. We have a certain fixed cost base. Every ride, let's say for the purpose of the conversation, we make $1 a ride. It's not the right number, but let's say it. Let's say we have $1 billion cost base. Again, not the right number, but let's just say that it is. That means if you do $1 billion and one rides, you're making money, right? If you do $1 billion and two, you're making $2. $1 billion and five, you're making $5. So roughly speaking, as long as our rides are making money, occasionally you'll lose money on a ride because weird things happen, but broadly speaking, as long as you're making a certain amount of money per ride, and as long as you keep your costs under control, you don't let your costs grow faster than your bookings, you're going to start making money. And that's literally what we're doing. Like literally, we grew, as I say, over and over again. We do 2 million rides a day roughly now, maybe a little bit more. We'll do maybe 700 million rides a year this year, plus, it'll be more, but we're like 800 million rides in total, including bikes. And the goal is to make money.
It has traditionally been a 2-horse race.
Yep.
But if you live in San Francisco, you will see
a third horse.
A third horse, right?
Yeah.
And even, I had an oh shit moment yesterday where one of my partners, Bucky, was here in the office late with me, and he was like, "Have you taken the Waymo yet?" Mm-hmm. And he was like, "I'm basically only taking that now." Mm-hmm. And I was like, "I haven't heard that before. Like, I haven't heard someone just get." So bought in like that, where like it's become their primary form of transportation. That's a tough one to deal with because at least in this 2-horse race, like you both have margin constraints because drivers are expensive and et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. But in a world where there's no driver, it's very hard. I don't know. That's crazy. That's crazy.
So it is and it isn't. And what I mean, so first, let me actually accept the premise that driverless cars are absolutely here and part of the fabric. We've talked about how I bike to work every day. I count the number of driverless cars that I see, and it is rarely fewer than 5 and usually close to 10, just in a 22-minute ride, right? Mm-hmm. So there, it almost gets to the point where you can't walk out of in fact, as I walked into your office today, literally there was a driverless car right at your corner who's actually backing up, trying to figure out a way for another car to get forward, which is kind of interesting to watch. Okay, so they're going to happen. All right, now, so then you get to the question of like, is it a good experience? And to your point, it's actually a pretty good experience. Now, here's some issues that we have to also acknowledge. And I'm going to ignore for just a second the elephant in the room, which is that not everyone thinks this is a good idea. There's some people who are going to object it. There's some people who are going to set them on fire, all sorts of crazy things.
And this is in San Francisco today.
And this is in San Francisco, which is a whole weird, its own bubble. So so let's note that like this progress will not be relentlessly forward. There'll be some back steps or side steps. But let's assume that it's going to happen. Maybe 2 years, maybe 5 years, maybe 10. Okay, fine. Now, why does your friend Bucky, your partner, like this experience? Well, first of all, it's novel. People tend to like new things. But second of all, that is a $300,000 car that he just got in. It's a $300,000 car. That's a Jaguar. Okay, so let's just start with this nice car. Yeah. It's just been washed last night because they're washing it every single night. And it's got a lot of cool tech in it, which is kind of fun for people in the tech world, which is not expensive to operate and very expensive to repair. But if you put all that together, you're talking about a super premium experience. You really are. Now, what did he pay for it? I'm betting he paid maybe 10% more than what a Lyft or an Uber would have cost. Now, that's interesting. Why is it more? Well, these are very expensive pieces of technology that are rolling around.
I think it's even more than that, by the way.
Okay. I'm being kind to them.
Yeah.
But often it is. Often, interestingly enough, and this is what's so interesting.
I think it's somewhere between like a premium black car and a regular.
That's about right.
Lyft.
That's about right. So it might be 20% more, 30% more, 40, 50% more. Interestingly enough, on that, it is more expensive and it's often slower because the route it takes is usually quite conservative and it stops at every single stop sign, comes to a full stop, all these things. And yet still people like it. So that's quite important to recognize. Like, gosh, people are trading off against the things they usually care a lot about, price and time, and are actually thinking the experience is super cool. But back to the thing. Though it's a very expensive thing to not just build, but also to operate. So that's important to remember because as much as people say, yeah, but there's no driver, yeah, but on the other hand, there's no LiDAR. Let's just talk about insurance. Insurance is very expensive for rideshare. There's $1 million of insurance in every single ride you're taking in rideshare. People don't really know that. It's quite an expensive proposition. It's legally mandated. In the AV world, insurance companies are being very, very, very cautious. So very cautious because they don't have the data and they know these things are very expensive to repair. So that's simply a long way of saying, if you think there's a big cost advantage to running a network that's incredibly expensive, building cars, building tech, and all the rest. By the way, maybe owning depreciating assets. There are a lot of costs that an AV fleet would have that rideshare doesn't have, right? In our case, owners own the cars. They deal with a depreciating asset. They handle all kinds of things. And then the cars are, $30,000 or $40,000 cars, not cars that are that much more expensive. So one thing to finish my little ramble on this is it's not super clear that the economics are going to be dramatically better. Even though your first inclination will be to say no driver, your second inclination might be to say there's a whole bunch of other cars. Second point I'll make is this, which is, again, I believe in a future of hybrid. Some cars are being driven by drivers, some are being driven by autonomous drivers, by computers. I think that is absolutely right. And I think that's stable, by the way. I don't think there's a world of 100% on either side. If for no other reason than customers won't always want it. There's some scenarios which are quite difficult. I mean, imagine AV picking up at the airport. It's quite complicated. And then there's also just, capacity, right? These are very expensive. And so, you've got to build a lot of cars again, we do 2 million. I've said 2 million rides a day a couple of times. I'll give you another statistic. There are about 1.5 million, let's say, drivers over the last 12 months who've driven on the Lyft platform. And every one of them owns their own cars. So now I'm not saying you have to have 1.5 million autonomous vehicles to do 2 million rides a day. You could probably do it with fewer, maybe, but that's a lot of cars, right? So it's going to take a long time for it to be that big. But here's the last thing I'll say. Let's say that you believe in what I think is actually quite an interesting model, which is you buy a car. Let's not use Tesla just because everyone talks about Tesla. Let's say Kia, which is also, or let's say Hyundai, so doing super interesting work in the AV space. You buy a Hyundai and you come home at night, or maybe even during the day while you're at work, and you push a button, and then that car turns into an autonomous robotaxi, right? That's a vision that people have said. Elon Musk has talked about this from time to time.
He was supposed to announce it a few weeks ago and has pushed it down.
He was supposed to announce it in August. It sounds like it's going to be more later. He sometimes gets a little ahead of himself, doesn't he? But whatever. He also lands rockets on platforms, so he gets maybe he gets a pass. But anyway, so okay, but that's an interesting vision. I think that's an interesting vision. I will say that's a vision that we also think is interesting. And what's I'd say notable about it is it's actually very similar to today's world. Today, you as a driver put your car on the platform. And when you do that, by turning on your app, when you do that, you physically get in the car because there's no other way. Tomorrow, exact same thing happens. It's just you don't have to get in your car. But it's literally the same thing. You still need to get paid. You still need to figure out what happens if someone throws up in your car. You still need to figure out what the best routing is, someone does. And all of that platform stuff that we do, we are a platform. We're a platform for millions of rides a day. I think is going to be a very equally applicable platform in an autonomous world.
Yeah, super interesting. And going back to our initial conversation, this idea of who is a platform continues to evolve. And I'm not going to put words in your mouth, but I do see quite a lot of synergies in what Lyft does as a purpose-built platform to connect people to rides with a lot of these other technologies. In fact, I think Lyft is very well positioned in that world. And, like probably what Google and Waymo and Tesla need is all of the network effect and flywheel and brand that you all have created, and all of the, let's just call it, elbow grease that you've put in over the last 10 years to figure out how to make sure you pick up someone on time, you do it in a cost affordable way, it's safe, etc. And so I'm really curious about how this future evolves. And more interestingly is that you and Uber, I'll give you both credit, have proven the economics of this business. And for a long time, this was a race to the bottom, just raising a bunch of VC money, spending it to then compete. And now you're showing that this is actually a real business model. And the interesting consequence of that is it's no longer becoming a two-horse race. And in a world where it's no longer a two-horse race, I'm so excited to see how strategies evolve in this world. And I'm sure you also are.
Of course. Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't just want to see how it evolves. I want to help evolve it.
Yeah.
And I'll touch on something that you just touched on. Like, so much of our lives right now happen in the digital virtual space. And yet we know this. We know this from science. We know this from common sense. We know this looking at history. We are social, right? We are at our best when we are physically in the same. You and I could be doing the same conversation, of course, over a Zoom call, and I guarantee you it would be less interesting. It'd be less fun. Just seeing the expression on your face, seeing your body language, and that's a very, very small thing. So anyway, I like, but by the way, the physical world is hard. There's a reason why people like spin out apps all over this. They're entirely virtual. I mean, many reasons, but one of them is it's hard to do physical stuff, and it's very hard to do physical stuff at scale. I mean, sometimes I compare ourselves to an airline. We like Delta Airlines might do 7,000 flights a day. Again, we do 2 million, and they all have pickups, they all have jobs. I'm not saying we're the same business. It is some things that, anyway, but the point is, physics is hard. Physics is hard, and it's relentless, and it's 24/7, and it's rain, and it's snow, and it's dark, and it's light, and it's complicated, and it's all these things. And so we have that. And what it does today is a good thing in the world, which is it gets people out and connects them to their physical world, not just their virtual world. And so when I look at all of those things and all the capabilities we had to, what do you do with gated communities, and how do you deal with that? How do you pick people up on the right side of the street when their restaurant is on the left side? All these different things. Gosh, we've built a lot, and I think it's a very, very durable set of capabilities that we've built that has a lot of applicability, to your point.
Yeah, super excited to see where it goes.
Thanks.
Really excited, and I think I do think that the board does have good judgment, and they made a great decision. Thank you for doing this. I really appreciate it. Are you hiring?
We are, and thank you for asking. So we, data science, super interesting. This is our head of what we call marketplace, which is rider driver matching, who is a PhD in physics. He's also like outlawed in Las Vegas because he's a card counter, but successful as one of those guys from MIT, literally. But anyway, he's also a data scientist and a physicist by training, and now a data scientist. He says this is some of the most interesting data science work he's done in his entire life, and the hardest because of the scale and all the rest. So data scientist, super, super important for us. And then ad tech. So in a world where, and we haven't talked about this at all, but remember, every one of those millions of rides we give a day, we know because you tell us where you're coming from, where you're going. Are you going to a CVS? Are you going to a Walgreens? You're going to a Starbucks? You're going to a Pete's? You're going to work, but maybe you like coffee. All of these things, this is first-party data that you're telling us through your destination. It gives us insight and ultimately, advertisers insight into some of the ways you're spending your life, and they might want to talk to you and give you a venti upgrade if you come to the Starbucks, and maybe they even pay for the dwell time where the driver pauses while you pick up your drink. So anyway, ad tech is going to be a super important world for us because it's a good way to kind of connect with customers in a new way and connect them with brands. So those are two: data science and ad tech. Come work for us.
When you hear the word grit, what do you think of?
I love this because it's such an evocative word. You know, you
really
almost
is.
right. It's almost not just like, I mean, in a sense, it's also a wrong question. It's like, what do you feel?
Yeah.
Because as soon as you hear it, you're like, it's
Yeah.
it's not just a think,
Yeah.
it's a feel. You know, it is for me. It is about that. You know, kind of relentless tenacity. You know, and kind of like just doing whatever it takes. You know, it's that simple. It's that simple.
I appreciate you. It was great to see you.
Thank you, man.
Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate your conversation, your research, and your willingness to ask questions that maybe not everyone would be willing to answer and get them to feel okay answering.
Oh,
it. So,
of course.
Well done.
That's the job. Thanks, man.
Well done. Okay, man. Until next time.
Thank you.